Mildred Pierce is a cautionary tale about what happens when you spoil your children and they grow up to become brats. Mildred Pierce is a woman living during the Great Depression who's married with 2 daughters. Her husband is seeing another woman and ultimately ends up leaving her for this other woman. But it's a little bit deeper than that. That's the gist of the story, right? Pretty much up to the point where the movie begins. The husband is, I guess up to this point, fairly decent. He's had a pretty good job, but runs into some hard times at work. I believe he was laid off or fired, something along those lines, but he ended up losing his job. Now there's some questions at home about how he's going to take care of the family, because bearing in mind that during this time in a lot of households, the dad would be the only one working. The mom was typically a stay-at-home mom. So if he's now out of work, how's the family going to survive? How are they going to take care of themselves? How are they paying their bills? There's this saying that financial issues, or more accurately, communication about financial issues tends to be one of the leading causes for divorce or problems within marriages, right? In this case, Mildred has some questions about how's the family going to survive? What can they do from this point on? Or what's the plan for how they're going to keep their heads above water? How are they going to maintain and take care of themselves and their children? The husband is kind of annoyed with having to answer these questions. And I understand both sides of the argument, but Mildred has some pretty valid concerns, because it's like, bills have to get paid. How are we paying them? What's the plan? Unfortunately, adding to the confusion, adding to the drama, is the husband seeing this other woman. And so with that, things kind of come to a head, and he decides to leave Mildred. Now, granted, when we talk about people back then, a lot of fuss was made about people getting divorced, and about people being, I guess, divorcing too easily now. But the reality is that back then, a lot of people, they might not have necessarily gotten divorces, but if you leave your wife and you go move in with some other woman, essentially you're now divorced in everything but name, especially because at this point in time, it then becomes a state of there seems to be no real plan. While he remains active in the children's lives, there's no real solid plan as far as how these children are going to be taken care of financially. He's hanging out with them, but he's not really supporting them anymore. And it's not openly discussed. It seems like the responsibility falls to Mildred, because if he's at home and he doesn't have a job, but he's not taking care of them, then what's going to happen? He's now left home, he's off with this other woman, and there's still no real plan in place for taking care of them. Now, going to live with this other woman isn't going to make things any better, but Mildred comes up with this idea that pretty much she's going to assume responsibility for taking care of these 2 children. She doesn't really have a choice, right? Because that's what the situation is. It's worth noting because this would happen to be in the 1940s. Now, granted, bear in mind that these characters are white. As for maybe not all, but many black women, they would have been working anyway, going back for centuries at this point in time. It just wasn't feasible for black women to stay at home, right? At least not full time. But in this context, this is a story about a white family. So it's a little different, right? There's this big transition surrounding her going into the working world. As previously, she'd been a stay-at-home mom, but now she makes the decision that she's going to do what she has to take care of her kids, to take care of her responsibilities. This is someone that has not been really working, or at least not outside of the home, and she's now transitioning into the workforce. She seemingly doesn't really have any skills or anything along those lines. So it's like she's not going to go into some big-time corporate job or anything like that. She kind of has to find something that she can do with the skills that she already has, or find a job that doesn't require much in the way of skills. And so with that, she ends up going into a restaurant to have a cup of coffee. And, things come about where she ends up working at the restaurant. And she's rather industrious because she doesn't just settle for working in the restaurant. Well, she actually meets one of the other employees at the restaurant, another female, a lady. And between the 2 of them, this other lady, she has a good understanding of the restaurant business. And so in getting to know each other, the 2 of them start to figure out that, hey, there could be a good amount of money in this restaurant business. So Mildred begins she starts out as a waitress, eventually uses her knowledge of things she learns through observation to kind of work her way up, and then eventually becomes quite successful as an entrepreneur, eventually owning her own restaurant. She comes from humble beginnings, as she does start out in the industry as a waitress. And, she goes into being a waitress because she needs some kind of way to feed herself and to provide for her 2 daughters. The problem is that she has these 2 kids. The younger daughter she's just like a regular kid, not given any problems or anything along those lines. The problem is the older daughter. Her daughter Vida has very expensive tastes and is incredibly entitled. This is in part due to her having been spoiled by her dad, but also being spoiled by Mildred, where even now when times are tough, things are going wrong and whatnot, Mildred's had to kind of tighten her belt. You still have Vida, who doesn't have any understanding about the situation. She still expects life to just be this grand party where she gets whatever she wants when she wants it. And it comes in part from her parents kind of giving her everything she wants. She's a spoiled princess. Her family, not to say that they're poor, they're doing pretty okay for themselves up until her dad lost his job. But it's like, they're doing pretty okay for themselves until the dad loses his job, but the onus is put on Mildred to become a provider. But rather than sitting down with Vida and explaining to her, like, listen, things are going to have to change around here, because obviously she's not picking up on this from seeing what's going on. Instead, Mildred just continues to pick up the slack. Her mom carries on trying to meet her increasingly unreasonable expectations. As Vida becomes older, it's like her expectations, her demands really just become more and more outrageous. The older she becomes, instead of maturing, the more entitled she becomes. And it's like, instead of nipping this stuff in the bud, Mildred just continues to give in. And so she starts running around, let's say, wealthy, or at least in comfortable circles with people who have more money than her family. She's putting on airs for these people, telling them, that she comes, or implying that she comes from a rich background. There's no reason why there should be any expectation for her to be living this very ostentatious, rich lifestyle. But somehow she's come to expect this. She's more than wanting to keep up with the Joneses. Instead of being grateful that her mother's out there working, trying to keep a roof over her head, she's instead embarrassed by her mother being a waitress. She's embarrassed by her mother having to even work for a living. But yet she has no problem spending the money. Mildred is in part to blame, because instead of putting a stop to this early, and teaching her some appreciation, responsibility, she just continues to try to buy her affection, trying to appease her, trying to meet her every whim, giving her every and anything she might want. And so it's like, you have this spoiled brat, and the situation is just going to get worse over time because you're indulging it. As the story progresses, you have it where the sense of entitlement just becomes insane. And Vera just gets worse and worse as she gets older. She then begins seeing guys, and it's like, the guy she looks for, it's not like some regular Joe Schmo or anything like that. It's, men who come from means, and you see her plotting and scheming with one young man. Then there's this other guy, I think his name is Monty, who starts out with Mildred dating Monty. And Monty's kind of like one of these playboys whose families might have had money at some point in time. And so they have the visual trappings, the outward trappings of financial success, but they've probably seen better financial days. And so, his family probably had money at some point in the past, but they don't have money like that anymore. Yet he's still trying to keep up appearances. He's kind of like the flip side of Vera. And by this point in time, Mildred has come up from her humble beginnings. She's built this business for herself. She has at least, I think, one restaurant, right? But then eventually grows into multiple locations. She might not have all of the outward trappings of success, but she's actually doing quite well for herself, especially to be a woman in those times. And yet here it is that she's surrounded by all of these people, or at least by multiple people, who are trying to portray or project this image of success and wealth, when really they're broke, or the money they're spending is not theirs. This is the case with Vida. It's also the case with Monty, as well as a few other characters that they come across. It's really interesting to see how this plays out over the course of the movie. This thing of people fronting with the money that they really don't have, going to the lengths to which people go to keep up appearances from a financial perspective. But then also, even just, this thing where Monty and Vera are trying to keep up appearances with regards to them being able to maintain this lavish lifestyle, spending money, being able to afford all of these fancy luxuries. But then at the same time, you have Mildred, who is giving into the nonsense and keeping up appearances by basically trying to buy Vita's affection, trying to buy Monty's affection, allowing them to just use her for money. So it's like, here it is that she's currently earned the lifestyle that she has. She's legitimately put in the work to afford herself some luxuries, but instead of taking that money and enjoying it for herself or providing herself or her daughter with a comfortable lifestyle, she's instead working herself to the bone, killing herself to give Vida the opportunity to front and pretend for people that don't really matter. It becomes this thing that devolves into Mildred kind of sacrificing more and more of herself, giving more and more of herself, in hopes of trying to win Vera's love. There's this thing of trying to get respect, love, appreciation from someone that's just incapable of giving it. And so with that, it's a really interesting movie. I've seen the original at least twice now, and that would be the version with Joan Crawford, which I think is actually pretty good. It holds up really well over time. But there's also a more recent remake that was done for HBO. It was a miniseries starring Kate Winslet, and that one's actually pretty good as well. Pretty much the storyline between the two are quite the same, not too much of a drastic departure, but the review that I'm doing here was for the original with Joan Crawford. But the one on HBO is also worth checking out. I actually recommend either version. But I would say start with the Joan Crawford movie version and then do Kate Winslet, as it's a pretty interesting story. As a result of business dealings, hurt feelings, and whatnot, there's like some murder and double-cross stuff. The police get involved. It ends up being a really interesting movie. Very entertaining, and I highly recommend it. It's a great movie for Mother's Day. Thanks for tuning in. To ensure you don't miss any episodes, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my movie review playlist. Go ahead and click the thumbs up button if you like what you saw, and go ahead and share it on social media.